As a constitutional law attorney, former senior legal advisor and personal counsel to President Donald J. Trump, Jenna Ellis believes in the rule of law and the importance of integrity in our elections. And she's ready to tackle the big cultural and legal issues facing America. This is the Jenna Ellis Show. Here is your host, Jenna Ellis.
Happy Wednesday, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Jenna Ellis Show. I'm Jenna Ellis, and we've been talking a lot about homeschooling and the rise of homeschooling because so many parents were forced to actually try it in the midst of the pandemic, which kind of backfired on the leftists because guess what? Parents actually enjoyed spending time with their kids. They saw that homeschooling wasn't nearly as difficult as the left makes it seem, and they actually enjoyed directing their children's education separate and apart from drag queen story time, all of these crazy sexual content that we've seen out of Florida. The fact that we even have to legislate over these types of issues to say, hey, kindergarten teachers, don't teach kids about your sexual preferences is really hideous. So homeschooling is growing, but there is still a backlash. And interestingly, the newest backlash has come from the United Nations, which actually isn't really new, but here to talk about it is my good friend Mike Donnelly, who is the senior global counsel for the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, one of my personal heroes. He's taught me so much about the law globally. And Mike, you wrote a great piece in the Washington Examiner. So what's going on with the United Nations?
Oh, Jenna, well, thanks so much. And I so appreciate the work that you're doing and have done. You're just a tremendous asset to our country, to our republic. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing. And, of course, where else would you expect to find equity, inclusion, and gender issues, emanating from but the UN? And when it comes to homeschooling, the UN, in their Global Education Monitoring Report, which is like 500 pages long, it's called Who Chooses, Who Loses. And they're basically throwing private education under the bus because they think that government should control everything. That's the UN. But, in this report, 500 plus pages, they did devote like a sliver, a splinter of time to homeschooling. Never mind the fact that everybody was sent home during the pandemic, 1.4 billion kids out of school. Parents were said, hey, figure it out, homeschool. They thought it was homeschooling. It wasn't really homeschooling, but whatever. And so now for the second year in a row, the UN decides that they're going to mention homeschooling. But do they mention that homeschooling produces outstanding graduates like you, for example? Not me, but you. I graduated from public school. Somehow I survived. And that's another story.
And somehow
anyway,
you're still great, but, you use me as a good example.
Imagine if I'd been homeschooled.
I know, the heights and the potential you would have reached.
I could have been president, Anyway, no, it was all good. But, and so do they mention that homeschooling is amazing and it works really great and it lets kids become who they are designed to be and play and, not deal with all the peer stuff that goes on in schools and the drama and everything else? No. What do they mention? They said, well, homeschooling exacerbated gender imbalances. Okay. I mean, guys, come on, really? Mean? You're talking about because moms or dads, somebody had to go home and work and do the homeschooling, and it was mostly the moms. Like, that's kind of normal, But here the UN is focusing on gender imbalances when we're talking about the education of kids. I mean, all they can think about is workforce participation.
Wow.
Really?
Well, and so never mind the fact that statistically there are more women who teach in schools than men as well, but somehow that's okay because it's participation in the workforce. What about that gender imbalance?
Great question. These are just common sense questions that they just their eyes glaze over. Okay, when you ask common sense questions like that, but It's even better. Why is homeschooling growing? The UN asks. Well, it's because, I want to get this right because I want to credit them. It says, it is because of a global conservative movement.
Oh, so it's the right-wing fanatics that are trying to indoctrinate our own children based upon our constitutionally protected fundamental right of parents to direct the education of our kids. Somehow, that's now totally evil that we're not allowing the state to manipulate our children and actually have the parents saying, guess what, we get to teach our children. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, I know that pesky thing called parents. And, I mean, that's really what this is about, though, Jenna. When you look at this report and you kind of plumb the depths of the 500 pages, it's really fascinating. I mean, well, most people wouldn't find it fascinating, but I get into that kind of stuff. And because I really want to know what these people are doing. And they have an agenda, folks. I mean, if you're listening to Jenna, you know that, because I'm sure she's telling you. They have an agenda, which is they want governments, states all around the world to control education. Why? Because they have a mission, which is to go after the hearts of your kids, the minds of your kids, through these what they call, and they use these words, noble ideas and ruling ideologies. Okay, I mean, their noble ideas are equity and inclusion and gender. I mean, what about freedom, liberty, equality? They talk about equity. Okay, not equality.
This sounds like the same corporate ESG in the workplace that they're now attributing to schools.
Well, equity has always been kind of one of those things that they want to push into the schools because equity is nothing more than socialism. Okay, if anybody was wondering like what's equity, you don't have to Google very long equity versus equality. They'll tell you equity is not equality. Equity is guaranteed outcomes. Okay, that's socialism, that's communism. Equality, which is what we all want, equality under the law, is that everybody has a fair shot, right? We all have the same opportunities to succeed, which is what this country is all about. And that's why millions of people come here, both for work and education from all over the world. But that's what they're about. They're trying to push this equity stuff into the schools so they can brainwash our kids. And lots of people here in the U.S. are just done with it. They're finished with it. And that's one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons that homeschooling has grown so dramatically through the pandemic. I mean, everybody started homeschooling for a couple weeks back 2 years ago. They found out, as you pointed out, hey, this isn't so bad being home with my kids. And lots of people are continuing it. Jenna, I don't know if you knew this, but homeschooling doubled in the last 2 years from 4 to 5% to almost 10% of all households in the USA.
Which is amazing. And that is such a great threat to the leftists and the progressives, because you're actually raising a generation of free thinkers, of people who then will go out into the workforce, will go out into public service, will become full functioning adults that have been trained by their parents and take advantage of all of the things that homeschooling offers. And they won't just be these woke leftists that are saying, okay, well, I need to have these same answers on all of these standardized tests and not think for myself. And so that represents a huge, huge threat to the left. And so when the UN is doing something like this, for people who maybe don't exactly understand where the UN versus America or our participation in that, was America part of this report? Did we endorse this in any way? Or how, because the UN is making this statement, how does that actually interact with policy in America?
That's a great question. No, this was a report by UNESCO, which is one of the UN agencies. It's the UN Economic, Social, and Cultural Organization. Okay, and guess who contributed money to the development of this report?
I'm guessing
I'll give you three guesses.
Soros?
His first name starts with G, last name starts with
Soros?
S.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at all the organizations that were contributing to this report, it was Mr. Soros who has an agenda. Okay. I mean, he wasn't the only one. You can look at all the other, foundations in there who want to support this thing. But this was the UNESCO organization, and they do this every year. Last year, they criticized homeschooling as being a challenge to inclusion, another ridiculous assertion about homeschooling. And I wrote another piece in the Washington Examiner. But here's the thing. And so, when you have an administration like the one we have right now, maybe they're influenced by this stuff. I don't know. Fortunately, in America, we are a republic. And as yesterday's great ruling by the federal judge on realizing that there actually is rule of law when it comes to how we deal with the pandemic and wearing masks on airplanes, which I'm about ready to get on an airplane, and I'm psyched that we had this ruling yesterday. We have a republic, and the states are the ones who get to make educational decisions. So even if the feds want to kind of take some of this UN stuff, there are plenty of states who, like Florida, for example, or Texas or whatever, they're going to say, no, we're not going to do that. And so it's not going to have a lot of impact, I think, here in the United States. But it does embolden and sort of prop up other countries around the world who look to the UN for, policy direction. And that has a way of filtering back here to the United States through the academic elite. And when you look at people who are criticizing homeschooling here in the USA, well, who's criticizing homeschooling? Mostly the academic
Harvard
elite.
professors, for example.
Yeah, right, exactly. Law professors like Elizabeth Bartholet at Harvard and others who, they don't like what homeschooling is. And as you pointed out before, they see it as a challenge to their worldview. So I don't see this report having a direct impact on U.S. policy, but it definitely reverberates around the world. I mean, when you look into Europe especially, I'm very concerned about what's happening to the homeschooling population in countries like England, Wales, in France, in Hungary. I mean, Germany is a lost cause. I mean, Germany is where all this stuff started back in 1938 with the Nazis criminalizing parents who, wouldn't send their children to the schools, which the Nazis took over for the purpose of weaponizing the education system for their totalitarian ideology. Okay, that's where this all started. And so they're a lost cause. But that idea of government control and the government having to control all children in education is permeating through Europe and in the homeschooling areas as well. And so that really concerns me because sometimes those ideas, make their way over here. They say that when Europe sneezes, America catches a cold. Well, this is not a cold we want.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is also something that if Europe is trending in this direction and the rise of globalism and how we need to be this whole, one world community, of course, that can eventually be a borrowed practice. And so this is something that we all need to be paying attention to and making sure that we are preserving and protecting our rights that our Constitution obligates our government to protect, like parental rights, to make sure that we never get that far. And that's one other thing, Mike, that I wanted to just highlight as well for among this whole conversation to all of my listeners, because we've had this conversation a lot on why the United States has not ratified or signed on to the UN Convention on Rights of the Child. And that sounds like, oh, don't we want children's rights? But like so many other things that are mislabeled by the leftists, that would actually create a situation where the government, rather than the parents, gets to determine the best interests of the children. And our society and our law and our government specifically recognizes, no, parents have rights.
Oh, it sure does. I mean, going back to 1925, our Supreme Court recognized that the right of parents to direct the education and upbringing of their children is a fundamental right. And in 2000 timeframe, that's been reaffirmed so many times. It's, been described as an enduring tradition that's beyond debate in our country. You bring up a really good point about the treaty, though, because this is the global elites, Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and all these people who have their vision, Bill Gates, they have this vision of a globalist future. This is one of the ways that they want to push this, into our country. And so we have to be very careful. We have to be very concerned when we see treaties coming from the UN being pushed into to our country. Our president signing them. UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was signed by Bill Clinton. It has not been ratified, but the attempt of these human rights treaties is to try to influence governments to move in this progressive left kind of agenda where the government is in charge of families and it minimizes families. And of course, if you can minimize families, then you can control society, because if parents don't matter in the lives of children, then you can get rid of these pesky ideas like religion and, conservative traditional family and these kinds of things.
And so even individual rights. I mean, the whole idea then that we are just part of the greater good. And that was the entire pretext of the pandemic to begin with, that we all have to do our part and we have to participate in the greater good no matter how many different individual rights we sacrifice. And so that type of notion and that fear that's built into a globalist agenda is very, very self-serving to the global elites, and it's undermining our entire notion of individual rights.
Well, it really does. I mean, the family is, it's interesting because when the UN report talks about noble ideas, there are actually some noble ideas in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, such as the idea that the family is the fundamental group unit of society, right? And it should be protected. which is definitely true. Or the idea that parents have the prior right to decide what kind of education their children should receive. Now, the Universal Declaration is not a binding treaty, but these ideas are contained in some of the early human rights treaties. I won't go into all the details on the names of them, but when you come to the more modern treaties, like the one you mentioned, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, that's one where the progressives and the left have started to realize, hey, we can use these treaties to advance our globalist agenda. So there's a good reason why we haven't signed that treaty and other treaties, and we shouldn't. Our country, we have a constitution that recognizes these rights, and that's the way it should be around the world. It's okay to say, we as a human, ethnic group, as the human race, so to speak, should have these ideas about life and liberty and respect those and agree that we're going to uphold those and recognize those. But at the end of the day, it's governments that have to create laws and implement the rule of law to protect those rights, and not having UN bureaucrats make decisions that can then be enforced in national courts, which is separated from the people.
Yes,
the people, we the people are the ones who should be making
sovereignty.
the decision, not these UN bureaucrats.
Yeah, and absolutely erodes national sovereignty as well. I mean, even though we may not like what another country does, we will respect and recognize that rather than giving away our own sovereignty to a global enforcement authority. Those are very dangerous. And one of the things that you've always talked about as well, Mike, is the danger of treaties within the context of Article 7 of our U.S. Constitution.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, the Constitution makes treaties, the law of the land, equal to the Constitution, basically, and superior to federal law. Okay, and so that's very dangerous. Now, since we are a republic, it's not that simple, but it's a very big threat because, and you can see in some places, in some states, where even the state legislatures are kind of being led down this path unwittingly, I think, in some respects, by those who have this idea of bringing international law into our country to get them to make changes in their state statutes to acknowledge these things. And I'm seeing this in the area of custody, recognizing custody agreements in countries like Turkey as equal to custody arrangements made in the state of Ohio, which I think is very dangerous for our country. And we need to be aware that this is happening. That's just one example. There are others. It's not happening broadly and widely, but that's an example of how it is happening. And that's how they want to.
Are you seeing judges ratifying some of those custody arrangements that came out of courts in other countries, or are we borrowing statutory language, or how exactly are you seeing that happen?
No. I mean, I've seen a few cases, a couple cases actually, my old home state of New Hampshire, where a mom fled Turkey, brought the kid, and you can argue over issues, but there were issues. And then the judge there in New Hampshire, because the statute in New Hampshire had been passed to recognize, basically giving full faith and credit to the Turkish court, the kid had to go. Now, again, facts matter, but this is troubling to me. This is very troubling to me that American courts are doing this. And there are other instances where this has happened as well. It's not widespread, but we need to be aware that this is what they're trying to do, and we need to be alert to it. And state legislators need to they need to become informed and not just do these kinds of things.
Yeah, and empower the judiciary by statute to not give deference to any of these other courts from other countries, and to say that they have sole jurisdiction to determine what's going on in these situations. So, I mean, that is really dangerous, because when you have other countries whose laws clearly conflict with the United States, we don't want to be deferential in our court system. That is incredibly dangerous. And so for these state legislators, though, Mike, it seems like there are very well-meaning people, at least on the Republican side. Some maybe not so much, and we kind of saw that, and you and I talked about that.
There's a mixed bag, election. I'm afraid.
Yeah, and but it also seems like even the most well-intentioned state legislators actually don't understand the authority that they have by state statute, because there is such a notion of deference to the federal government, especially in areas like education, which is the exact reverse of the constitutional structure of federalism. Why do you think that is?
Money. I'm sad to say. And,
Wow.
And you can look at everything that's happening in our country right now, and you can find money is at the root of a lot of it. I mean, when you look at, I won't go into it. We're here to talk about education, not about healthcare. So We'll just leave
That's
it
a whole other separate conversation we
yeah,
can have.
and I don't want to go into that right now. I'm just happy I don't have to wear a mask on the airplane tomorrow night when I fly off to New Hampshire. I'm just excited.
But like education and healthcare, both of those are not subject matter that's given to Congress under Article 1, Section 8. They actually have no federal legislative authority over those two issues. And yet somehow, just because of this ridiculous interpretation of what the necessary and proper clause or interstate commerce that has been completely bastardized, they think that they have that kind of authority. And I think you're right. It's because of money, because then they have these federal grants that are tied to the states, and the states don't want to undercut their own financing, so they will just say, okay, fine, we'll leave it to Congress. And so there's so much emphasis on what's going on in Washington instead of government being close to the people. That's really problematic.
You couldn't have said it any better, Jenna, and I'll just amplify that. And it's even worse because a lot of the state legislators are ignorant of this, not willfully, but it's because the bureaucrats are the one who run the show, right? And they know they get these billions of dollars from Uncle Sam. And so they go to the legislators who look to them as subject matter experts, and they're saying, no, we can't do that because we'll lose our billions of dollars from Uncle Sugar Daddy, And in a state like West Virginia, where I live, we're talking large amounts of money, okay? And at a certain point, we as a country, we as free people, we need to cut that cord a bit. I think more than a bit. We just need to cut it and say, you know what, we're going to run our own show. We're going to balance our own books. We're going to make our own policy based on what's best for our people. And so what if it's a little bit different? I mean, the reality is 90% of regulation, maybe it's 70%, 70 to 90% of regulation on education comes from the federal government because of 10 to 15% of the funding. That is fundamentally contrary to the system that our founders gave us. We've got to figure out a way to go back to the way it was and stop this.
We absolutely do. And, people talk about a new revolution or a way of getting back to we the people and making sure that we're preserving and protecting our rights. The best way we can do that individually in states is to elect state and local officials who understand this, are willing to stand up in governorships like Ron DeSantis, are willing to stand up like these local school boards where parents are actually running to say, we're not going to let the federal government or the government period tell us what we have to teach our children with all of this sexual content. So all of this matters, and if each state would recognize the constitutionally prescribed level of sovereignty that they actually have and start implementing that and not worry about these big grants and basically say to the federal government, too bad, we're going to run our own state, that would change America back to what we had at the founding, which was supposed to be a very, very small federal government with state sovereignty and a government close to the people. And I hope that we actually, in 2022 and beyond, will elect different people who understand this to state and local positions, who are willing to do that. Even if it takes a little bit and it's not as comfortable for a little while, they see that long game and they're willing to go back to America as we originally intended it.
Well, I hope so too. And I think that the rise in homeschooling is indicative of that. I think when you look at what's happening with court decisions regarding these pandemic constraint issues, like yesterday's Trump-appointed judge who said, no, CDC, you don't have the authority to tell people to wear masks in airports and on airplanes, which we knew, but they got away with it because we just went along with it. Okay, that's just one really great example of it. And as parents are going to school boards and they are running for election in these offices, I think there's a lot of hope. And I think when you look at homeschooling and what's happening politically in our country, I think it shows a lot of what makes America different from the rest of the world, because you just see a lot of other things happening in the rest of the world. And so I think there's a lot of hope here. I'm hopeful, I'm encouraged. Folks who are interested in homeschooling, there may be people listening to us right now, Jenna, who didn't know you were homeschooled, although I don't know how that could possibly be. But maybe they're thinking about homeschooling
I talk about it all the
year.
time, but yes.
Do you? Well, good, I'm glad.
Yes.
Maybe they're thinking about homeschooling next year. Well, I just want to encourage that mom or that dad listening right now. Go to hslda.org. Check out our website. We have got all the resources you need to learn about how to homeschool in your state. And homeschooling is a great way of life. Just listen to Jenna. Just do it. I mean, I've got 7 kids. They're all doing well. Look at Jenna. I mean, man, there's a success story.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And, homeschooling was such a great opportunity for me and for my family. And now my three little nephews are being homeschooled and they absolutely love it. And, my sister-in-law wasn't homeschooled, but she saw how great homeschooling is for a variety of different reasons, especially because, she and I talk about, she said when she first had kids, it really dawned on her, I'm responsible for the worldview and training of this little person that God has entrusted to me. And homeschooling is the best form of discipleship for children and the best way I think that parents can fulfill their mission to be the best parents that they can. And as Proverbs says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's older, he won't depart from it. The best way that we can fulfill that promise is having parents so involved in their children's education, because it's a form of discipleship and mentorship. And my family loved it. There are a variety of different ways to homeschool. Mike's family, as he said, you have 7 kids, and you and your wife Patty are so great, and your kids are all so great, and they're doing well. And so many families who have chosen to at least try out homeschooling, the kids and the parents love it. So go to hslda.org, and you can find out so much more about homeschooling. And Mike has done such a great job on a global level of advocating for the rights of parents. And so I really appreciate all that you do too, as well, Mike. And thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Jenna. Keep up the good work.